Gun rights groups outspend gun control groups in federal lobbying. Plus, monthly gun sales continued their downward slide. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. The reload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things going on in the world of gun politics and policy. To kick things off this week, we want to talk about some updated lobbying numbers under the Lobbying Disclosure Act. All lobbyists are required to obviously report their activity and how much money they're spending trying to shape policy on the Hill. And we have a write-up of some of the first quarter numbers, which obviously include a changing of the guard in Washington, D.C., with Republicans in control of both chambers of Congress and now President Trump back in the White House. So certainly a big time to try to shape policy. And it looks like the gun rights groups agree because they were, by a pretty substantial margin, outspending the gun control groups in trying to influence legislation.
Yeah, and probably a bigger margin than what's shown in the disclosure reports that we were able to take a look at, or that you did this piece. So you were able to take a look at, because a couple of big spenders on the gun rights side, I guess their reports haven't been filed yet or not made public yet. We're not really sure what's going on there. It's for Gun Owners of America and the National Association for Gun Rights. Neither one had their Q1 filings, at least on the government's disclosure website yet. And you reached out to them. They didn't respond to a comment. So we don't or comment requests. We don't exactly know what's going on there, but we do know that those groups last year were spending significant amounts of money on lobbying, and probably did in the first quarter too. We just don't have the report. But what we do have shows still that gun rights groups managed to outspend the gun control groups by a significant margin. And they were led by a group maybe most people wouldn't necessarily expect, unless you're really plugged into this stuff, which, I mean, I suppose people listening to this podcast probably are, but so it might not be as much of a surprise to you guys. But the NSSF, which is the National Shooting Sports Foundation, was the top spender by a significant margin as well in this first quarter here. Now, the NSSF, right, they represent the industry. They're the trade group for the firearms industry. Although some of these gun companies themselves also will do lobbying independently from NSSF, but most of the industry's efforts are funneled through them. They were well ahead at this point of the National Rifle Association, which is what most people might assume is, the top dog, just given their huge overall size as an organization. But, they've clearly waned in recent years on this front of lobbying and this is federal lobbying, by the way, right? So this doesn't include all the state level lobbying that goes on, but you would expect that the NRA, I think your average person would think they would be the top, but they weren't. And what did those numbers break down like?
Yeah, so like you said, the National Shooting Sports Foundation was very clearly number one. They reported about a little over $1.8 million in first quarter spending on lobbying activities. And second came the NRA, and they reported about $530,000. So already a pretty big delta there between number one and number two. And then you had groups like the Firearms Policy Coalition and the 501c4 arm of the Second Amendment Foundation, which is the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, I think is the acronym. And they both reported about $50,000 worth of spending. So fairly limited in that regard. And that sort of rounded out the big, at least broad spectrum pro Second Amendment groups in terms of their influence.
Yeah. Although GOA and the National Association for Gun Rights, they had been spending hundreds of thousands in previous quarters, right?
Yeah. They tended to be more akin to the
range.
NRA in terms of their quarterly lobbying spending, at least as of recent. But like you said, we just don't know yet what it was going on in Q1 with them.
Right. And then on the other side, the gun control groups were still spending money, right?
Yeah. So about $400,000 altogether, if you count the big three gun control groups, which is what we usually do over here when we report on this stuff. So that's Everytown, Giffords, and Brady. And no surprise, they kind of spent in accordance with their relative size. Every town was the leader in lobbying spending, about 260 grand is what they reported in the first quarter. Giffords reported about 100 grand, and then Brady reported about 40 grand worth of spending in the first 3 months.
Yeah. And so what were some of these bills that these different groups were spending on? What did their actual lobbying look like?
So the NSSF was pretty much anything that you can think of that intersected with guns, they reported as at least doing some sort of lobbying on. So whether that was the big ticket stuff that your grassroots gun rights person might care about, like national reciprocity, or the Hush Act, or to try to deregulate suppressors, they reported lobbying on that. But they also reported lobbying on much more sort of wonky issues like appropriations riders, and also industry specific things like the big sort of whiplash with export licensing, which we reported about. You sort of had the hangover of the Biden administration's Commerce Department rule, and then some uncertainty with what Trump was going to do because he sort of freezed those exports at the beginning of his term. And so they reported that as one of their big lobbying concerns. And then obviously some of their marquee legislation that they've pushed dealing with anti-discrimination legislation with the financial industry. It's like the FIND Act, for example, is something that they've been big proponents of. And so they reported on that, spending on that. The NRA, similar. They also had a pretty broad spectrum of different bills and policy areas that they reported lobbying on, as well as, outside of the Second Amendment space, they also reported on a lot of hunting and conservation type interests as well, which makes sense considering they have a track record of doing more than just narrow Second Amendment advocacy, and also including the outdoor activities. The smaller groups just listed protecting the Second Amendment. It was very general what they said that they were lobbying on. So I'm not sure exactly what that means in practice. And then the gun control groups is sort of similar, a mirror image, where they also reported just a broad spectrum of issues, most likely opposing whatever the NRA and the NSSF are pushing for. And then one thing that really stuck out to me, because there's one sort of outlier, was that one of the things Brady reported lobbying on had nothing to do with guns. It was they lobbied in favor of making Washington, D.C. a state, which I kind of found humorous when I saw that.
Yeah, well, it's a couple $1,000s from Brady is going to make the difference there.
Yeah.
No, obviously that's something you see common in left-leaning groups, is advocating for DC statehood. So I guess sometimes I feel like the gun control groups are even more prone to doing sort of intersectionalism, right? And crossing over and advocating for other left-leaning issues. And working with other groups. You see this often in their political advertising too, right? Every town's ads will often talk about abortion before they talk about guns, if they talk about guns at all. Right. The NRA does that too, to a certain degree. But I don't know. It just seems like it happens a little more often in the gun control circles. Maybe just a cultural thing with how the political advocacy works on the left versus the right, but I don't know, just something that I've noticed. Anyway, pretty interesting too. And it's not necessarily a new trend to see NSSF dominate these numbers, right?
Yeah, going back the last couple of years, they've really been a big player in at least the lobbying side of things in the gun space. As I noted in my piece, since about mid-2019, every single quarter, they've reported at least $1 million in lobbying spending, where none of the other groups have done that. So they've really kind of established themselves as the top dog in terms of trying to influence gun policy on the Hill.
Yeah. So it's, this is a change that actually happened a while back, but does seem to be related, I think, to the NRA struggles, directly related to that, where they just don't have the same kind of resources to put towards this as they used to. They also don't have the same personnel that they used to, right? Like, Chris Cox had a lot of connections when in the early Trump first administration days. And I don't know whether they have that same level of influence now on the Hill that they did back then. They churned through a number of heads of their lobbying arm, the Institute for Legislative Action. So, and of course, they've been constrained as well by the reduction in of funds and resources they can put towards this. Although, as we discussed in the last interview podcast, they may be turning a corner in that regard, and they may have more money to spend on this moving forward now that their legal fees are going to be significantly lower, it looks like, headed into this year and next year. So the other interesting thing about all this is, there's obviously a lot of money on either side. You mentioned in the piece that the gun control groups are spending money on bills that have literally no chance of passing in this Congress. But, the gun rights groups, I don't know how many of these bills are going to pass either. You might get some of them through the House, and that's a might, right? Because the House, the margins there are very tight. You're not getting any Democratic support on basically any of these gun bills. There's been literally 2 Democrats in the House who have co-sponsored any of these priority bills from NSSF or the NRA. And with the margin the way it is, I don't know. It'll be a close vote in the House. You may get a couple of these bills through, but there's no way they're getting through the Senate unless they become packaged together. I think if it's a smaller issue, right, and it gets packaged with some other bill that's much more, it's part of a big omnibus bill, like this huge bill they're doing on reconciliation. I don't know. I don't think any gun stuff is going to make it into the reconciliation bill. It doesn't look like it. But maybe, down the line, some other bill, some other omnibus package, you get a smaller gun rights reform in there. Maybe that has a chance, but I don't know what that would look like. I don't know which bill that would be at this point. And so you might end up with none of these bills getting through. Maybe find, the financial, the sort of Anti-Discrimination Act, or I don't know, though. It's hard to say that you're going to find enough votes, 60 votes in the Senate to get any of these through, whether it's pro-gun or pro-gun control.
Yeah,
but
it is a good point. There hasn't been any legislation that's really passed this current Congress, let alone something as controversial as guns. So I think it is a good point to make that despite all this
one
lobbying,
or two things, right? But very, very limited number of things. Lincoln-Riley Act was very early on, almost in the immediate aftermath of the election. And now I think also the willingness of Democrats to pass Republican priority bills has reduced a lot since then, especially with the way that Trump has tried to bypass Congress on so many things. I think that's probably hurts any efforts to get bipartisan legislative deals done on this stuff. So I don't know. We'll see. I don't know how much of this money is going to end up being fruitful in the end on either side.
But we'll, of course, stay on top of that because, like you said, the political conditions have changed, and very clearly that seems to have translated into enthusiasm because one side is spending about 6 times more than the other side to try to influence this stuff. And we'll
it makes
stay on
sense.
top of that. Yeah, it
does make sense for them to do it. If you're going to spend lobbying money on pro-gun bills, this is the time to do it. I mean, you're not going to have a better chance most likely next year after the midterms. Like, you just ignore everything going on in politics specifically today and just look at the historical trend. The midterms turn out poorly for the president's party almost every time. There'll be a matter of degree of how poorly they turn out, but so your best shot is right now when the party that you've backed is in power in the presidency and in the House and Senate. But there's still political realities to deal with. That's all I'm getting. Like, it makes sense for them to spend the money because they got to try. They're not going to have a better setup than this moment right now. But you can go back to 2017, and that was true then, and you just didn't get any really significant pro-gun legislation through back then either. Whether things are harder now, I don't know, but it's certainly similar, and I think you're gonna probably see similar results. It feels like.
Absolutely. We should get the next crop of numbers, by the way, on this stuff in July, the Q2 spending. So we'll see if the needle moves one way or the other at that point, and whether any corresponding legislation moves one way or another. So stay tuned for that. But speaking of the industry, on the gun sales side, you had an update for us on the Reload about what gun sales have done. And it seems like they've continued their trend of diminishing sales, let's say.
Yes. Yeah. Sales were down again in April, year over year. Right. So here's a key thing to mention as well about gun sales. Gun sales are seasonal in the United States. They fluctuate throughout the year in a predictable way. So they increase a bit in spring, then they fall in summer, and then the best time of the year for gun sales is in the fall and holiday season, like a lot of things, right? But even more so for guns because that's when hunting season is. There's not as much hunting going on in the summer as there is in the fall, and so sales fluctuate around those periods of the year. And so April's sales will be lower than, October, November sales will be. But what we do when we look at these numbers is we look at them compared to the same month from the previous year or other years. And that's what the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the industry trade group, right? That's how they analyze the numbers as well, because that gives you more of an idea of what's going on in the market, more so than comparing April to January does, because January and April's numbers are always different. And I think usually they're higher in April, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly here, but than they are in January. So comparing month over month is not as useful as comparing year over year. So with that all in mind, April's sales year over year were lower in 2025 than they were in 2024. And that is how it was in March. That's how it was for the entire first quarter of 2025. And really, you've seen that since the end of the election. You've seen sales declining on that year over year basis. And April was another month where it was the lowest sales levels. And, again, just to clarify how we get this understanding. When I say sales, I guess what I'm really saying is National Instant Criminal Background checks for that are related to gun sales, because and this is determined by the National Shooting Sports Foundation looking at this. The FBI puts out all of its NICS check numbers, that background check system, all of the raw numbers every month. But they also code those numbers based on all sorts of things, whether it was a handgun sale or rifle sale, and whether it was a permit check, right? And so NSSF goes through those numbers and just isolates the ones that are related to actual gun sales. And this is not a one-to-one of how many gun sales actually occur in the United States. There's no way to know that because we don't have, a national gun registry. So you can't just, like in California, in theory, you can know exactly how many gun sales happen, legal gun sales at least, because California has a national register, has a state registry, and they require everyone to go through the checks and they keep data on all this stuff. Now it's not as readily accessible as the FBI numbers are, but you can track at least the lawful sales in California because it's illegal to sell them without going through all that stuff in the state. On the national level, there's nothing like that, right? In fact, National Gun Registry is legal under federal law. And so instead, we use this analog, these background checks, because FBI background checks and NICS checks are required on all sales done to customers by licensed dealers, and all new sales of guns have to go through licensed dealers, and most gun sales generally go through licensed dealers. That's licensed dealers, anyone who sells guns from a gun store or, any sort of business that sells firearms has to get a federal license to do it. A lot of people at gun shows selling guns are going to actually be licensed dealers. If you go to a gun show and it says, Johnny's Guns, he's got a sign up or whatever, he's almost certainly, unless he wants to get in trouble with the ATF, a licensed gun dealer, even if he's selling at a gun show, because doesn't matter where the sale occurs. It matters who the sale's between, whether it's a licensed dealer and a private citizen or two private citizens selling, a used gun. And then it doesn't matter where it happens. Online, if you buy from Bud's gun shop online, Bud's is a licensed dealer. He can't ship the gun directly to you. He has to ship it to a local gun store, and then you go there and pick it up, and there's a NICS check that happens at that point. Anyway, regardless, what I'm getting at is NICS checks cover most likely the vast majority of gun sales that happen in the United States. And the reason we don't use the raw checks and we use this NSSF adjusted number instead is that the raw checks also include permit checks. So like if you go and apply for a concealed carry license, and well, not most states anymore because most states are permitless carry now, but the 20 plus states that still require a permit, I think every single one of them makes you go through a NICS check during that process. So, and some states like Illinois, for instance, will actually recheck all of their concealed carry license holders, licensees every single month. So the raw number that the FBI puts out includes hundreds of thousands, if not more, checks that have nothing to do with gun sales. And so that's why the NSSF numbers are, I think, the gold standard for measuring this stuff. Now, there are also states where you can use, if you have a concealed carry license, for instance, you don't need to go through a NICS check, a new one, when you actually purchase a gun. You can also buy multiple guns on the same NICS check, so on and so forth. And then most states don't require NICS checks on those used sales between private parties. So some used gun sales wouldn't show up in these numbers either. But anyway, now that I've explained all this, so hopefully people understand how we get this analog for gun sales and why we use the data that we use. What it shows us is that sales were down in April, and that April was actually the worst of the post-pandemic Aprils, April 2025. So, the worst in 5 years, and really approaching those pre-pandemic levels. I think, in fact, that it was lower than 2013, for instance, where you saw a huge spike in gun sales around after the Sandy Hook shooting and the federal debate over new gun restrictions in the wake of that. It's just another month where the market's not doing very well. And excuse me, but I think there's at least two reasons. There's multiple reasons for this, but the two big ones are likely maybe counterintuitively to some people, but Donald Trump's election, because he's perceived by most gun owners to be somebody who's unlikely to enact new gun restrictions, that lessens the motivation to go and buy a gun out of concern that you might not be able to buy that gun in the future or what have you. That's something that drives gun sales, right? We know that. And so you don't have that motivation. That's part of it. And then, that's where Trump slump in his first administration, that's where the concept comes from, that sales were down because people didn't have that sort of panic buying around that was politically motivated. And so the other more general concern with the industry is just the state of the economy, right? Where consumer confidence is at like record lows right now. Guns are not, generally speaking, a necessity, especially after you've already bought your first gun. You don't necessarily need to buy 5, 10 more, right? It's a hobby as a collector. You don't need to buy a firearm. They're not perishable, right? Ammunition is to a certain extent because it's consumable, but your gun is not necessarily going to expire or go bad after a month, right? You can guns, they only have two enemies, right? Rust and politicians is the famous saying. So, you can literally use the same gun for 100 plus years and it'll still function if you keep it in decently good shape. And then, the tariffs, the economic instability being caused right now by President Trump's tariffs impacts every industry, but it also is likely to impact the firearms industry. In fact, that's what our interview podcast is going to be about this week. We're going to have on somebody from a company that sells ammo, but also tracks the market with a lot of detail in the data. And I think that'll be really good to just give us some real insight about what is actually happening in the market right now. Because, we've talked about here's what is likely to happen, or here's why tariffs are probably going to raise prices across the board in the industry. But, now I think it's been enough time to where we're actually starting to see some of these effects. And so that's what we're going to focus on in the interview podcast. But yeah, it's those two factors, the lack of political motivation to go out and buy guns and the economic uncertainty we're experiencing right now that's been compounded by this whole tariff trade war situation is probably dampening the outlook for the gun industry and reducing demand. But of course, demand has been falling for a while now, right? It's not 2024, the election didn't even really boost sales that much from what we saw with these NICS numbers, at least. So it may even be more of a structural problem with the industry as well. Now, I will say there were some bright spots, right? Like I think it was 1.2 million sales, through the method we talked about. They found about 1.2 million sales in April. So you're still over 1 million a month, which is something the industry, NSSF, has touted for a long time now. I think it's like almost 40 months of that at this point. And, if you look back at 10 years ago, I think sales in April 2025 were still something like, was it 30 or 40% above what they were 10 years ago. So, and on the long horizon, sales still outpace like population growth, for instance. So if you're looking at a broader spectrum, beyond the last 5 years, the numbers don't look as bad, right? So, and then but at the same time, you look at, for instance, Ruger's stock price and their earnings report. They just put out their earnings report at the end of April, and their sales were basically flat. They were down about $1 million net sales out of 134 million, so pretty much flat. While the rest of the industry has been it's not like a massive decline, right? It's only a couple points lower April from the previous April. So, it's not like a free fall by any means, but yeah, the Ruger numbers speak that out, and the market doesn't seem very enthusiastic, the stock market, about where at least Ruger is, or Smith & Wesson, because Ruger's stock is down, I think, 20% since the election. And Smith & Wesson's even worse off. They're down like 30%. So, investors don't seem that enthused by what's going on in the gun market either. But yeah, that's what we're seeing on the NICS check front right now.
Yep, absolutely. And it's something we continue to keep tabs on because, like you said, this has been a big story, not only the last several years, but sort of the rapid rise of the firearms and sales market, and then now the sort of return to earth situation we currently find ourselves in. And
I feel like there's
political valence too. Yeah,
they're still searching for that floor. Honestly, I mean, we've been talking about this since the Reload was founded. But where's this new? Because usually the other thing, the gun industry is seasonal, but it's also cyclical, right? Like the tendency is that you have big surges and then climb downs, and that happens over time. And usually it's around political events, or really the reaction to major mass shootings is when or not even major mass shootings, just chaos, right? The pandemic being the most extreme example of this. 2020 was record-setting year across the industry. There, and you not only had the pandemic, but also the murder of George Floyd, and then the riots that occurred in reaction to that. All of that created sort of a perfect storm for gun buying for people across all sorts of different identities and political beliefs. And the industry that was their greatest feast, and now they're still experiencing that famine. Like the Biden years didn't really sustain that level of gun buying, even with a president who was aggressively trying to expand gun restrictions, mainly through, ATF rulemaking. But, and so they're still trying to find the ultimate floor of where are the sales going to even out at. They're still slightly above, April was still a little bit above pre-pandemic levels, but it was getting closer and closer to there. And you wonder if that's where they're going to end up back where they were before the pandemic started, even though they brought in all these new gun owners. I don't know if they've been able to convert them into repeat customers, right? That's one big question that I see when I look at this continuing decline over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Listeners should go check out that piece at thereload.com to see all that data and the write-up and some charts. They can follow along with what's happening in the firearms industry.
Oh, by the way, one area that saw much more gun buying than you might expect, or at least more than is usual, is your home state, Colorado, right? Colorado is population-wise is the 21st most populous state. But it was actually in the top 5 for NICS, gun sales related NICS checks in April. And I think we can all guess why, right? That they passed that big gun control package. And I guess, people responded by going out and buying guns.
I was going to say, it's one of the cases, at least at the localized scale, of how political fluctuations can drive gun sales.
It's another example of it. Yeah, you can see it in the numbers. Like Colorado, people are buying a lot more guns than makes sense, for the population, and at least in line with what everyone else is doing. And I think it's pretty obvious what made the sales spike there, which is this sweeping new gun control legislation that the governor signed in April. So if you're out wondering how can you tell these effects, well, they're pretty straightforward correlation right there between big gun control bill gets signed, huge sales spike in guns happens immediately afterwards.
Yeah, it's a good point.
It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out.
Yeah, absolutely. But speaking of state level fluctuations, this one doesn't have to do with gun sales, but a new law that was passed in the state of Tennessee and actually signed into law by the governor. Sort of a continuation of a trend we've seen in red states and quote unquote pro-gun states, but with a little bit of a twist. This one has some wrinkles that I'm not sure I've seen before in these state bills. And this is a liability protection, or at least a bolstering of their existing liability protection for gun businesses in the state of Tennessee.
Yeah. And it actually, I didn't mention this in the story, but it does expand those protections to other, I guess, like self-defense industries. So knives and pepper spray and things of that nature get included in some of these liability protections. But yeah, it's an expands on, the Federal Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, because there's been a 30-year long fight over whether you can hold gun companies liable for the criminal acts of third parties, whether it's, a street crime where somebody uses a gun to murder a police officer or something of that nature, or a mass shooting, right, where somebody kills a dozen people, right? Is the gun company liable for that act if they weren't directly involved in it, right? If they have no direct involvement in the crime, they didn't know it was going to happen, they didn't sell the gun knowingly, to help the person carry out the crimes, anything like that. And so that's what the PLCAA, the federal law, was meant to try and cut down on these types of lawsuits, these liability lawsuits. But there are a number of exceptions to that law, which gun control advocates have tried to find ways to use in order to sue gun companies, and sometimes fairly successfully. Obviously, the Sandy Hook settlement with Remington being, I guess, probably the best example of that, even though that didn't win in court on the merits, but they did get far enough to where Remington, or at least sort of the defunct Remington Arms Company, which had gone bankrupt, their insurers decided to settle with the Sandy Hook families, and that was a big win for the gun control advocates. And they've been trying to replicate that ever since around the country. And one of the ways they've been doing that is that a lot of blue states have been passing laws that are sort of designed to fit into those exceptions. A public nuisance. Well, one of the exceptions to the PLCAA is this idea that if the gun company has violated a law in connection to the situation, then they don't get that liability protection. And so some blue states have tried to expand like consumer protection laws to rope in gun company advertising as, if it violated state law in some way, then, PLCAA protection is eliminated. And that's kind of how the Sandy Hook case ended up proceeding, was around the advertising from Remington. And so in response to that, you've seen red states now try and tighten up those exemptions. And that's what Tennessee is doing here, just sort of trying to eliminate different concepts of liability from the options available to somebody if they want to civilly sue gun companies. That's essentially what this bill does. But it also, as you mentioned, there's like a limit. There's also this interesting provision that's just another way of discouraging civil liability lawsuits against Tennessee-based gun manufacturers, which, by the way, they've had quite a number of large manufacturers move into the state over the years, because there's been an exodus from sort of northeastern states that have become less and less tolerant of gun companies and the products that they produce. And so a lot of companies have moved from Massachusetts or New York down to southern states, one of them being Smith & Wesson, which is now in Tennessee. And so one of the provisions of this law says that even if you go and file a lawsuit against a Tennessee-based gun company in another state, or at the federal level, I guess, is my understanding of this, and you win a judgment against them, if you come to Tennessee to try and enforce that judgment, and you've won on the basis of something that's not allowed, these liability concepts that are now not allowed in Tennessee, not only will you not be able to collect, you're not going to be able to file that suit, but also if the judge determines that the logic you're using is not allowed under Tennessee law, the gun company will be awarded 3 times the judgment amount and legal fees on top of it. So just a very harsh provision for anyone trying to realize the judgment in one of these civil liability suits against a gun company. So that's something I haven't seen before out there, but it does speak to how this is unfolding in the states, where you've got, on the one hand, a lot of blue states are trying to make it easier to sue gun companies for the criminal acts of third parties, essentially. And on the other hand, you have red states trying to completely eliminate that possibility.
Yeah, and put up some pretty substantial disincentives to go down that route in the future. That's fascinating. As we're coming up on time here, touch on a few just brief newsletter links. One of them comes to us from our friend Cam Edwards over at Bearing Arms, talking about the Trump administration has sort of laid out its preferred budget situation. And one of the big provisions, at least for our purposes here at The Reload, is his suggestion of cutting a substantial chunk of the money that currently goes to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
Yeah, it's it's always interesting to talk about the president's budget, right? Because his budget proposal, because it almost never actually becomes law, right?
Right. That's an important caveat.
Yeah, the president will put out but it does mark his priorities. And so I guess this time around, unlike last time where his budgets had seen at least modest increases in the ATF's funding. This time they're targeting the agency for significant cuts. And so that, it says something, and they did base the argument on why they should be cut on this idea that under the Biden administration, they used the ATF in a way that they claim it was weaponized to go after gun owners, lawful gun owners. And so that was one of the reasons they're giving for why they want to reduce the size of the ATF. And effectively you'd have to lay off a bunch of people if this actually went into law, which, to be honest, it's probably not going to. Now, it may, look, if the president, especially this president with this Republican Party, like I would say he has more internal control over his party than presidents have traditionally at this point in his, Republicans in Congress seem much more willing to go along with whatever he's doing than previous Congresses have been willing to do, even if the president is in their party, right? Like, it's just how things have unfolded so far to me. Now, I don't know that that's dynamic is going to last forever, especially if his polling numbers continue to come down. But that is something to consider, because like they may be more inclined to actually trim or significantly cut ATF's budget because Trump is on board with doing that. I don't want to, it's obviously not nothing, but I wouldn't expect that the president's budget is just going to be adopted as is by Congress. I think a lot of the cuts that he wants to make at these agencies that you've seen Doge kind of messing around with, from my understanding, is that they haven't been incorporated into, Republican budgeting in Congress to this point. So at least not to the level that Elon Musk has and others have wanted to see. So I don't, I doubt it's going to be this level of cut, but maybe you will see a cut to ATF in the whenever they get to their final budget in Congress. Interesting change of direction too. He was in his first term increasing funding for the ATF, and now he's in the second term. His administration has taken a 180 on that, and they're pointing to those restrictive rules that ATF put in place under Biden. Of course, a lot of those rules are inspired by the bump stock ban, right? It's the same basic concept of how they got put in place. But it does suggest that he's being responsive there, I think, to gun rights groups and what they want. They would like to see, I think, a reduction of ATF's power and size. So that's what he's advocating for, at least here. How much of that translates to actual budget law, we'll see.
Yeah, that to me is the big takeaway, is that whether or not it makes it through, which like you laid out, probably won't make it into the actual budget as envisioned, it at least shows that he's channeling some of the Second Amendment groups' priorities to defund or even dismantle the ATF. So I think that's interesting. But something related to the administration, something that he's doing that is not what the gun, or at least the hardest line gun rights groups would want, is that his administration, according to this Courthouse News Service piece, is arguing in court in defense of the federal machine gun ban. An interesting write-up of a Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals argument. It's one of these criminal cases. It sounds like the reporting's a little fuzzy, but it sounds like this defendant was caught with a quote-unquote Glock switch, so a standard handgun that was illegally modified with an auto sear. And the assistant U.S. attorney in this case, on behalf of the DOJ, is arguing strenuously that the machine gun ban does not violate the Second Amendment.
Yeah, and honestly, using some of the weakest arguments out there, right? Like when she asked for an analog, she pointed to gunpowder storage laws at the founding, which she claimed it was indicative that people, the founders limited how much gunpowder someone could own, which is not actually how that law worked. It was a fire prevention law. It was about how you stored gunpowder, but obviously hard to say that that's an analog to the machine gun ban. Now, I will say that the DOJ is probably on perfectly firm ground here with the Supreme Court. Wouldn't expect that the Supreme Court is going to actually take up and overturn the Hughes Amendment, the ban on machine guns, or even honestly the NFA itself. The court has been pretty deferential on those restrictions in its very limited Second Amendment jurisprudence to this point. And in fact, she's citing a case that, it was decided in the lower courts that upheld the machine gun ban, but did so by basically just citing dicta from Heller, which is how a lot of these get upheld, right? In practice in the lower courts, is just Heller talks about how, bans on M16s are fine, essentially, but bans on semi-automatic handguns are not, because machine guns are, fall outside of the protection of the second. I mean, they don't get into detail. It's a passing mention, right? And that's why it's dicta. It's not part of the actual holding of Heller, but it is in there, and it is used very commonly to address this exact argument in the lower courts. But the main thing here is just seeing DOJ and how they're operating on these questions, because honestly, it's kind of, I think it's hard to predict where they'll fall down on some of these things, right? Because you've got them arguing in favor of the machine gun ban. Now, politically, I don't think that's super controversial, right? Saying that, because, the illegal Glock switches are not something that have a huge constituency, even within the gun rights movement. Certainly there are people who support, oppose the machine gun ban and the NFA as a whole. And, that's definitely, especially online, a very loud contingency of gun rights activists. But I don't think it's a popular position generally, especially if you look at like opinion polling, or if you talk to Republican lawmakers. It's just not, and you don't see it as a top priority for most of these gun rights groups either.
You actually do see red states actually passing laws to ban at the state level. Alabama, for instance, just signed a bill to ban auto sears and,
right,
machine gun modifications. So, like, to your point, there's
especially
not really
the Glock switch in particular, because it's so associated with street crime, right? That's most of the people who have Glock switches, especially because there's just the vast majority of Glock switches have been made after the Hughes Amendment went into effect. So there's like no legal way to actually own most of them. It's very, very difficult to own them legally, even compared to it's compared to other fully automatic weapons. The only point here is like, not the strongest legal argument, I would say, but also probably likely to win anyway. I don't think it comports with Bruin's actual historical test very well, but I don't know that actually matters. This is a thing that I think a lot of people get caught up on in the gun rights space, is like, yeah, I can certainly see how the machine gun ban, especially the Hughes Amendment, is not lawful or is not constitutional under the Bruin test, but under a strict reading of it. But I don't know that the Supreme Court is going to actually take up a case like this and apply a strict reading to the Hughes Amendment. So they're probably on fine ground, but it is interesting just to see where they're arguing, what they're arguing in court, right? They're arguing against taking up nonviolent felon case. They're arguing that the machine gun ban is constitutional. And then at the same time, they're arguing like Hawaii's sensitive places restrictions or gun-free zone restrictions are unconstitutional, and the court should take that case up even on an interlocutory basis. So, which is something you don't really see the DOJ get involved in when they're not a party to the case like that. So it's just, we're trying to keep track of what they're saying here and there, and whether you can make sense of all that into a specific coherent. Now, you remember the DOJ is not one guy directing everything, right? It's a lot of lawyers across the country enforcing hundreds of federal laws all at once. So they're not always going to be in constant communication, or you can't expect total consistency here, but it's something we keep track of and follow and report on.
Yeah, that to me is the big point. It's just because a lot is in flux in terms of the DOJ's litigation positions on Second Amendment stuff under this administration. Yeah. So it's just always interesting to see which cases they do and don't decide to defend.
Right. And this would not be a deviation from how the DOJ has previously handled this stuff, right? For under lots of administrations. So that's not, the news Certainly. Isn't that they're changing their position. The news would just be that here's what they're arguing. And it's the same as what's been argued by the DOJ for a long time in these cases. And you can judge whether or not it's a good argument or a bad argument, or whether it's a good argument that's going to fail or a bad argument that's going to succeed. I would say it's probably the latter of those two things. But it is noteworthy for sure. But yeah, I think that's all we've got news wise. You got any fun plans for this weekend?
Hopefully watching my Nuggets play better than they did last night, where they got blown out of the water. Had a great cardiac Nuggets first game where they stole game one on the road, and then they got absolutely blown out of the water yesterday. So hopefully back to game one play style in going forward. But yeah, so watching my team in the playoffs.
Well, at least you're in the playoffs. We're still trusting the process 15 years later over here in Philly, I guess. We got one good player out of that whole tanking era. So cool. Great job, everybody. And then the Flyers got screwed in the NHL lottery. They were in line to be fourth and they got sixth instead. So cool. We have maybe Michkov can drag them to the playoffs by himself. We'll see. I guess we'll have to probably see going forward. No goaltending and like very little talent surrounding what's probably one of the best young players in the entire league. But at least the Phillies are doing well. But they're playing in the Rays, right? Tampa Bay Rays. Their stadium, the roof got blown off in a hurricane, right? Last year. And so they're playing in a minor league stadium this year, which has been really kind of fascinating to watch. It's kind of like watching like an an exhibition game. Like the Phillies, I remember they played a couple of years ago. They do like the Little League World Series does like a MLB game. And the Phillies played in that a couple of years ago. And that's what this feels like, because they're in a minor league park. George Steinbrenner Park. It's like a Yankees minor league park. But the Rays have, rented it out for the season. And it's just weird to watch because it just doesn't, it feels not like MLB, but actually in kind of a good way. Also, nobody cares about the Rays. It's in Tampa Bay, I guess. And don't they play like somewhere, I don't know, Florida baseball is weird, right? Their fan bases are strange down there, I think. And their locations of where they put their teams and their actual stadiums is strange too, right? Like Tropicana Field is not actually near the city that the team is from. But anyway, it seems like it's almost entirely made up of Phillies fans down at this minor league park. And you can hear everything for some reason. Like you can hear all of the people way more than you can at a normal MLB broadcast. It's been really cool to watch. And also I think the field is shorter. So like every swing that Kyle Schwarber takes is practically a home run. So they've been doing great. Hopefully they'll keep that up. And I guess we'll see how that all goes. But yeah, that's all we've got. I am going up to Pennsylvania for my grandfather's funeral, or we're having like a family lunch situation for him. I wrote his obituary and that was published, and I was really happy with how it came out. So it'll be good to see family for that, as much as it'll be a sad occasion. But that's why we're doing this a day early, because that's tomorrow on Friday. So if you're the praying type, please just say a prayer for my family and my grandmother especially, and for my grandfather. But I am looking forward to getting together with the people that love my grandfather and spending time with them remembering him. So that should be a good experience. But that is all we've got for you guys this week. And we will see you again real soon.